Going to begin recording. And let me once again welcome everybody to today's event, Cross-Boundary Transformation, Making It Happen with GIS. Today's event is sponsored by the Leadership for a Networked World program and by the Government Innovators Network. And I'd like to turn things over to the director of the Leadership for a Networked World program, Jerry Mechling.
Thanks very much, Jim. We're going to try to pack a lot of information and discussion into an hour period, so I'll try not to take too much time, but we're continuing to focus on the issue which the Leadership for a Networked World focuses on, which is how do we make a difference? How do we create a change that's valuable for the public? And we believe there has been a history of these changes that have been very important, but there's a future that's going to be different as well as probably even more important. So let's go over that. Our program has been looking at the kind of change recently that we would call transformational change, not incremental change. And today's version of that we want to look at is how this is happening with geospatial information systems. And specifically, there are three elements of our conversation to pursue in this next hour. The first one is what the academic side of this tries to bring, a little bit of the theory on how GIS can open up new models of service delivery and new models for engaging the public and helping decide what to deliver. But the real core for this afternoon is going to be practice. What's really going on as these ideas are being developed and used and modified in the real world. What is emerging good practice in GIS-enabled cross-boundary collaboration? And by cross-boundary collaboration, what we're referring to is not the past where most efforts were within a given program and within a given agency, but much of the most interesting stuff today involves multiple programs, multiple agencies, multiple jurisdictions, multiple nations. It's cross-boundary, and that's what we're looking for. In addition, the audience has a very important role here in developing questions that explore where the ideas being discussed from the leading edge, as it were, of much of what's going on may go next. What's ripe for action soon? So that's what we would like to cover. What we think is very important to note to just position this is that GIS are a very important dimension of both organization and analysis of what's going on in the world. They're not the only dimension. Time has been very important. What's happening now, in the recent past, in the future. We've always used time as a dimension for holding people accountable and for organizing things. In government, I was a budget director. Dollars become very important. Budgetary allocations become very important. We organize budgets. We hold people accountable for budgets. We analyze budgets. Clients, another dimension. We produce services in order to meet needs. Needs are usually best expressed by clients who have those needs. We need the information. We need to share information. We need to analyze information about clients. And of course, primarily, we've organized government by individual programs. And so we want to know how we organize and what we can learn about those programs. The key thing, however, today is to notice for how long people have always thought about organizing activity and understanding their world spatially. It's the first thing babies learn to deal with, and now government, through our new capacities, is finding that this fundamental dimension for thinking and acting is becoming a lot easier to navigate because the technology makes it a lot easier to navigate. That's important, but it becomes important primarily when we do something with it. One thing we can do is to deliver our services to places and to people in interesting ways, in important ways, and e-government so far has focused very much just on the delivery of services, making the offer of online, not inline. What we see happening today is that more and more the change is happening throughout the production process, throughout the value chain, throughout the supply chain. So we're working not just on delivery, but on production on a cross-boundary basis where the changes are large enough to be transformational. Most governments and most leaders are thinking about decisions in the boxed area between those two curves now. They're shifting attention from one to the other. And for GIS, that's presenting new opportunities for multi-institutional service delivery that's location-based. I now know of farmers in the part of Ohio where I grew up who, when fertilizing their food, their fields, are getting GPS feeds that will change the mix of fertilizer based on where the tractor is precisely. It's a location-based customer service. We know that disease and the pandemics that we're all concerned about are having now very important early indications that can only be identified if we can share information geographically and quickly. Crime patterns are getting analyzed in this way as well. Crime that used to be available only by district last month has information that's much more valuable when it can come by house front with incidents in the last week and predictive quality as to where bad people are going to be in the next 48 hours. Similarly, we've had interesting possibilities and huge demands for public safety and security integration, fusion centers, and other activities where it's the geographic perspective that's enormously important. And environmental data was one of the earliest places that we looked for geographic relevance because it was just so obvious that the world was organized that way. Our information ought to be organized that way too. So what we're trying to do for this next wave of production-based change that's looking at the relationship GIS will have to it is to say what's happening and what's going to happen next. This is a learning curve where adoption of a better mode gets developed through the S-shaped curve after somebody who is a first mover and a pioneer invents it, and takes often much of its most important activity from the fast followers who will modify it, make it rigorous, allow it to be disseminated. Much of our attention today, and probably for some time around today, is noting that the world often faces a gap between the early work and the point where it takes off and gets really relevant to everybody else. Can we bridge that gap by bringing together the early folks with the later folks more productively? We think as we're moving to cross-boundary work, we need to note there's limited authority to force things to happen, but at the same time there's less resistance to what's happening because work now isn't coming so much by command and control, but by self-organization and innovation. And we're getting to a point where there's critical mass and disruptive change, tectonic change, big change, that's being opened up by geographic information systems. The questions I'd like to pursue with our group today are both decisions about community readiness, where is this ripe for action, financing and how we get the funds together, and issues of standards or ways to share that don't require as much command and control. There's classically mistakes that can be made about all of those decisions. On the community readiness, we can either move too soon, lock into things that are the wrong things to lock into, or too late, and just not find it possible to coordinate major cross-boundary transformational activities. For financing, we can be too narrow in what we do, or too permissive. And in standards, we can be historically too proprietary, having only a few actors and a few firms control the intellectual property that allows things to be shared, or too public and not having the discipline to allow ourselves to continue to innovate and go forward. I'd like to pursue those issues, particularly around what's ready to take off, with the important sources of cross-boundary transformation and experience that we've got around this virtual table. I'm going to turn first to Molly O'Neill of the Environmental Protection Administration, which has got some very interesting experience flowing about federal, state, local cross-boundary work, geospatially. I want to turn to regional, Oakland County and Michigan, and Scott Oppman, who's got some important experience to bring to this table. And I want to turn to Pat Cummens of Esri, where the private sector has perhaps the longest and most intensive work and experience to bring to the table about cross-boundary transformation with geospatial information systems. So Molly, let me turn it to you. What do you see what's ripe, what can you bring to this particular table today?
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you for inviting me to participate. This is a really exciting time to be working in the geospatial area, and as someone working at EPA, I can tell you that I think we're about to really embark on some really exciting things. I wanted to start by simply talking a little bit about how GIS is really an enabler for this transformation that you began talking about. First of all, as many people know on the call, GIS is really becoming mainstream, and the core enabling technology is there. And at EPA, we are a place-based organization, as you said earlier, and because of it, we've got multiple requirements for a lot of deep integration around geospatial data and analytics. But like a lot of government, we are at various stages of identifying all of our business processes that can really benefit from geospatial intelligence. But really what we're finding now is the GIS tools and services are transforming across jurisdictional and sector boundaries in a lot of different ways. We see, and we're testing a lot of different tools out there in terms of mashups, where we're empowering stakeholders to carry out their own spatial visualization of key data sets. Not all data sets, but key data sets. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And we're seeing standardization for the data capture and management across distributed programs around there. So it's a really exciting time because there are so many things coming together for us in terms of capabilities from the technology, but also, as you'll see at the end, we have this convergence of people who want to actually have our data spatially. And so I think there's really a lot of drivers for making huge leaps forward in the GIS world. So one of the things I do want to highlight, though, before I talk about where EPA is in terms of some of our partnerships, where we are with GIS and where we're going, I do want to state that often in some of these discussions, while it's great to talk about the tools, I do think standards are really important. And when we talk about standards, this is particularly important to us at the EPA because we do have these large networks of people. A lot of people don't realize at EPA we are a huge consumer of data and information. We're not just the generators of that. In fact, I think more than 90% of our data actually comes from our state and local partners. And so it's really important as we begin to collect information and exchange information in true multi-directional pathways, that we have some standards in place for looking at geospatial data as well. In fact, for those of you who haven't heard about our National Environmental Information Exchange Network, we have this interoperable exchange out there with the 50 state environmental agencies and with the US EPA, where we're exchanging using web services and XML all sorts of environmental data. And so instead of getting it on a yearly basis, we're getting it a lot sooner, in some cases real time. But really one of the components of that is looking at how we display this from a geospatial standpoint. And one of the things we learned out there is that each state has its own geospatial standard, and at EPA we have our own standard. So how do we come together on a standard where we can make the exchange easier? And so that's really been an important component as you look at different layers of exchanging between various partner models. So
could I interject a second, Molly?
Okay.
Can you give me an example in particular from either the National Environmental Information Network or another activity concretely where making the information available in real time has made a difference? Sure.
Let me give you an example. Out in the Pacific Northwest, they're exchanging data between states in the Pacific Northwest. So it would be Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California, that area. And water quality sampling data is one that we were receiving at EPA on an annual basis if we could. In fact, some of that data flow wasn't even occurring back then. I'm very happy to say as of this year it is occurring. So we're actually getting huge data sets that we didn't have access to for a very long time. But in this particular case, the states are publishing that data, making it available to different partners, and actually leveraging the network. So in the state of Washington, the water quality sampling data is published on a secure point in the network, and using web services, they're actually feeding that on an hourly basis, or maybe it's a daily basis. I don't know exactly what the final agreement was, to the Department of Health, because the Department of Health was having an issue in terms of looking at some birth defect, looking at trends for birth defects around a certain area. And so it was interesting to see that we could actually, the Department of Health could access that environmental data to see if there are trends and relationships to some of the sampling results that are found in that particular area, to look at some correlations. So that's a real-time example. And clearly, looking at it from a geospatial standpoint, we were looking at it in terms of a specific place. And so that's an example of really where we're starting to penetrate by having access and delivery and what I'm about to talk about, which is really services out of this data so that it can be consumed and used more freely. So sort of brings me to our future near-term focuses, and I'm going to wind my introductory up at the end by just posing some questions back, and I'm hoping to have some dialogue in the Q&A portion of this. But in the near term, the geospatial application interface development is really becoming less of a focus for us. I can't tell you how many years it took for us to put one of our main geospatial and maps out there called EnviroMapper. It took us a lot of money and a lot of time to do that. But really, with Esri's ArcGIS, Explorer, Google Earth, Microsoft Visual Earth, and whatever the next products are, these things are in wide use now. So we can really spend the time on less development on the base maps and all the associated cartography, and we can really spend our effort on the presentation of the agency's data and really work on providing that data out and focus on making data services available in a consistent and discoverable manner so that we can actually try and take our data and serve it up so that other people can consume it. And I really think that's a really powerful change in approach. We spent so much time in the old days of making sure the maps are right and plotting things, but now we can really talk about servicing that same data out so that it can be leveraged out there. So I think it's a wonderful thing that's going on here. So I'm just going to talk about where we are yesterday. I think I mentioned that we spent many years doing this EnviroMapper application, which allows people, the public, to go to our EPA website and look for certain data sets geospatially to see what's basically in their backyard. And a lot of that had to do with where the NPL sites are, the National Priority List, if there is a water permit for discharging, or some of the water quality, some of the air quality issues. Today we're really migrating from sort of pointing on things on a map on where they are to really this geospatial web services model where we can service out our data in XML and make it available so people can download it and consume it in other products. And really, so as tomorrow, if you look at on my slide on the tomorrow, we've got all these websites that are actually using some of our data. The second one on there, www.terrames.com/web services, is really consuming our NPL data to show it geospatially on an interface that's already out there. So the question becomes, at EPA, and I really want to stress at EPA, I really think that we have drivers for transformation. This is one of the reasons why I think it's really important that every federal agency hires a very qualified and strategic geographic information officer, because we have so many investments around our departments and so many tools out there, but it's not the tools anymore. It's really about how we're delivering this data out for consumption. And so we have a lot of drivers. The technology's ready, and on the EPA side, the public demand is there. People want access to our information. In fact, I would say we're at the cusp from an environmental perspective to say, yes, people are always interested in certain of our layers of data related geospatially, whether it's our air quality or something. But we're seeing a totally different request and demand in terms of making environmental data a real commodity. And a couple of examples here. We have real estate agents and developers now asking for access for information on where brownfields are, which are redeveloped lands, or where there might be, Superfund or proposed Superfund sites, or the quality of the land, so that they can actually put that up in their documents in terms of selling property or developing property, and they want the web services out there to come grab the most recent information. Same thing for beach quality and beach closures. The hotel industries are beginning to ask that they have access to where the water quality data is for beaches and where the closure data is. So actually post that on their website. So again, it's a commodity to them to say, we have clean beaches. Please come to our hotel. So we're really, from the environmental standpoint, really coming to a peak in terms of the public demand, the business demand, the technology, and we have our communities and partners who are willing to actually help us in this effort. Which brings me to my last thought on here. I started this by saying I think transformation is here, but the question is, and the hard part as a federal CIO is the government ready to work with collaborative tools? Because that's really the next piece of this. So we now have not just Wikipedia, we have Wikimapia. Should there be an EnviroWikimapia where the public can locate releases to the environment? We're already seeing pieces of that in some of the states where nonprofit groups who are out there doing samples run across and find a drain somewhere, and they're able to upload through their GPS tools the location of where they spotted something into the state agency. Well, that's a small piece of it. But if we were to put something out more globally and really look at the collective public in terms of whether they're nonprofit, whether they're a private citizen, whether they're states, whether they're locals, and we had sort of a collaborative tool to look at things, perhaps that's where we're going, especially from a geospatial standpoint. It becomes a lot easier to mark things. But the bigger question is the government ready to expose data to really serve up to this networked world? And that's really at the one of the things that I think that we're definitely ready to do, which is really serve it up and make it available in a way that's really useful. The harder part are the willingness to work in the collaborative tools, because as government, we tend to want to control our data sets, and we want to control who owns that data. And by bringing in other sources, it really provides a challenge in terms of ownership of the data, where it came from, the data quality, and it begins to expose you to other things. So that's where we are at EPA, and as I mentioned, it's a really, really exciting time from a GIS perspective and a geospatial perspective, and I'm really looking forward to the next year or two, because I do think there's going to be fundamental changes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Molly. Some people asked about if you could put up the web locations again. I think actually we can wait and we'll post all of these activities. Having put them up again in that session, that's very good. They'll be able to get to that. It does seem clear that when we get geometric growth of use and users, then the early folks and in many cases this is government folks defining data for a well-known early but much smaller audience. When that audience starts to double and then double again and then double again and again, you're getting to a different kind of coordination and collaboration that's going to be challenging for government folks. As those challenges go down to regional operations, Scott, can you sort of tell us what's going on from Oakland County and how that compares to what Molly has said?
Certainly. Yeah, we can go ahead and get started on that. I'll just spend a few minutes on the background and then maybe jump right in. So I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about today is how we've focused historically on data at local level and the use of data, and kind of present that we're a little farther along in the continuum now, and I think it's important that we realize that and kind of carry some of the same parallels that Molly mentioned, at least from the federal level. The scale may be different, but very much the same concepts apply, and I think you'll see some similar themes throughout the presentation. For the purposes of context, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but let me see how these things come up here. But essentially, I want to just point out the fact that, Jim, maybe could you get the transitions going on this? How do I do that, I guess?
Yeah, well, try clicking down or pressing your down arrow key. If that doesn't work, then I'll just navigate through for you.
Okay, go ahead. If you can navigate through, just go ahead and let them all come through. So I just want to point out, Oakland County, while we're a county by nature, we really are a region. We're made up of 62 local units of government, or what we call cities, villages, and townships. And in many cases, we provide services, much like regional agencies do, directly to those communities and to the constituent. We're a large county by Midwestern standards, and so some of those things really play heavily into our vision for how technology, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is used. From an organizational context, we're like many suburban counties. What's interesting is that we're constantly balancing that rich set of natural features we have. We have 400 inland lakes with the high growth characteristic, suburban growth into the rural areas, large infrastructure costs, trying to preserve that quality of life, and ultimately maintain a competitive business attraction climate so we grow and can continue to maintain the services we've become accustomed to here at Oakland County. One thing that I think is quite unique to the county, and we can talk about how this relates specifically to cross-boundary collaboration, but we like to use technology as an enabler for collaboration. And we look and clearly articulate visions for technology, recognizing that we're serving the same taxpayer, right? The resident that lives in Highland Township is the same resident that pays city taxes, township taxes, or county taxes. And so we try to effectively deploy solutions to meet their needs and remove redundancy wherever possible. In many cases, that drives us to enterprise deployments. We host services on behalf of the local units of government and focus heavily on data integration, both horizontally across jurisdictional boundaries, or organizational boundaries, but then vertically also across jurisdictional boundaries. Ultimately, we look at the full range of benefits and work on 6-year ROIs for all our initiatives. And then what's unique about that is we consider not only the savings to the county, right, and this speaks, Jerry, specifically to your comment of budgeting, but also how the constituent as a whole would benefit from something the county may fund, but yet the local unit of government will get the benefit from. And ultimately, like many folks, we're working towards this concept of information capital, right? Knowledge is king and knowledge is power, and how do we leverage that to deliver service to our constituents in their entirety. Like many programs across the country, Oakland County has evolved. We started back in the mid to late 90s with several GIS programs. Each department had their own system. Many of them had their own software platforms, and we really couldn't leverage the expertise and knowledge even within county government. Sometime along the mid to late 90s, we decided that's it, enough's enough. It took some financial coaxing, which helped. And we said, we've got to start working together. And so we focused on some very specific fundamental data sets. We focused on a common software platform, which would be the language that we would all speak. That would allow us not only to mitigate costs, but also leverage expertise across jurisdictional and across organizational boundaries, so we could work on common problems, come together, and then not be struggling with, well, whose software is the most efficient, and who's got the, who's speaking the truth, before we even began to address the problem. Somewhere in the mid to late 90s, we really saw transformation within Oakland County, and we began embedding the technology, GIS technology or geospatial technology, in business applications. And so we kind of moved away from the traditional, it's a GIS application approach, to starting to integrate the technology in business applications, and things as fundamental as 911 dispatch or tax and assessment. In Oakland County, a 911 call that's dispatched is using GIS data. You can't get a new tax record created without using GIS technology. And so we're really, really focused on the integration of that technology in business problems, driving real solutions, and ultimately being able to use the technology to erase, knock down, you can use any term you want, organizational boundaries, and make them more transparent, not only within government, but also to our consumer as a whole. About a year and a half ago, we wanted to take the vision for technology and geospatial technology in the county and kind of advance it and push it. And so we set out on a strategic planning session, and in doing so came up with a reasonably articulate vision of where we wanted to be in the future. And what's interesting about this vision that we arrived at through consensus building with our departments was that it's now all about using geography to solve problems, right? And where we're using it to organize government functions, right? Resolutions, permits, other actions, official actions that government take, and then ultimately make it an integral part of how we manage data at the county, and then using it to formulate environmental, all the policy decisions we wrestle with, and Molly mentioned some of those. And then also picking up on Molly's theme too, enhancing the opportunity for individuals, constituents, to participate in the governance of their community. And so we're really recognizing this as a whole new opportunity to take this data that was used by maybe hundreds within county government, maybe another couple hundred within local jurisdictions, and now advance it so constituents and community members can participate in their government more actively, just by delivering a sense of place. So the implications of that vision, and we've been working really hard. We're fortunate here in Oakland County, or at least I feel we're fortunate that GIS and geospatial technology is a critical part of our IT architecture. That allows us to capitalize on the strong IT architecture we have and deliver services to our constituents, and also makes it a lot easier to integrate that technology in business applications, so it's an embedded part of what we do. We recognize the technology as an asset, much like roads, much like infrastructure. We have to care and feed it. And make it part of a critical investment. And then what we're working very heavily on is making that data widely available to citizens, other government agencies that may have not taken advantage of it, and then the educational community as a whole. And then finally, one of the things that we're working really hard on as well, too, is making it pervasive yet transparent, right? You don't have to fire up a specific GIS application to maybe consume GIS technology, right? It can be embedded. You can ask for directions. You can route inspectors. You can dispatch a 911 call. And you can do that using GIS technology and geospatial data, but not necessarily use a traditional GIS application to do that. So one of the things that we've recognized throughout the course of that the last 10 years, and it's been accelerated, I think, over the last year, is the fact that geography is now a large part of the internet search technology, right? And we've seen Google and Microsoft come on board, and it's really changing our whole paradigm, and it's changing the way constituents interact with county government and what they expect from county government and the geospatial data that we maintain. Many of our peers across the country are probably getting similar calls, but we're now getting calls and emails from constituents saying, my road's not in MapQuest. Can you fix that? And that's the perception now, right? The perception now is government is that data custodian, and yet why is that information not available in these large internet search engines and as part of the critical part of their content engine? And it's interesting, right? There's a whole debate that's now evolving, right, on what is reality, and it's all centering around this trusted source of data, right? And here's a cartoon I saw in an article I saw in Computer World in August of this year that I thought was interesting, right? And that we're now having this debate over what is accurate content and how is it available to me as a constituent, right? And it's interesting to see how this is shaking out both within the content providers space and within traditional GIS space, right? And so you've got Google saying we'd like to see the equivalent of Wikipedia, right? And you heard Molly make reference to this, right? This concept of Geopedia. We've got traditional GIS folks saying, oh boy, I'm not so sure about this, right? How are we going to manage this concept of trusted source so we are sure that are assured that people are getting access to the right information and making valid decisions with that information, right? And then ultimately, that's being then contradicted with the fact that, hey, if we get the tools in everyone's hands, then someday, ultimately, we'll converge on the truth, and it may or may not take that concept of a trusted source to get us there. So as a community over the last several years, right, many of you are familiar with these initiatives. We've had several initiatives that have worked to bridge the cross-boundary initiatives we've had between federal, state, and local government, specifically in the GIS community. They've had varying levels of success. We've had a lot of help from the private sector, and I named a few here. But ultimately, many of us are left feeling like we're kind of slugging up the hill right with a pickaxe and backpack when the private sector came along and said, hey, look at all this great geospatial content. It's now available to you, and you guys start using it. You guys being the constituent group. So we're forced to take a look at a scenario someday maybe that could Google and Microsoft ultimately approach one of our senior level executives and say, hey, we can do what you guys have traditionally done with GIS and potentially save you some money, and on top of that, get your content out there and available to the masses, right? Because that's what everyone's hearing. Why isn't tax information from Oakland County available on the web? And things like that. So, the future, kind of how we see it here, right, is that while we've focused very heavily on data custodianship, and we see that focus shifting, right? The advent of Web 2.0 has really forced us to take a different look of what our consumer markets are demanding. And we really need to stop dinking with the data, right? And what's interesting is that many of us as local governments have been so focused over the last 10 to 15 years on the accuracy and precision of data. Well, in many cases, the private sector content providers have demonstrated that that doesn't matter anymore, right? It's all about sharing data and using that information. And one of the things that we've seen is that the private sector, and then making that technology available, develops applications at a pace there's no way government can keep up with. And so we really need to challenge how we're going to respond to this. The other thing that we've noticed is that the online content providers have really defined the modern base map. We used to think about the modern base map as being very good survey control, digital imagery, cadastral information, roads, topography, and you go through that traditional layer stack. Well, now we're seeing that really imagery, transportation, and rooftop addresses are the kind of the gospel truth on the web and in the content world, and they're using those major themes of information to organize content and deliver content to the constituent groups. And one of the things that we're noticing too is that, in many cases, the government data providers are being bypassed by the private sector, right? What is the real value government brings to long-term content and data content, right? Is it the first 6 months that a new parcel is created before the GDTs of the world or the Navtex of the world pick up on it and say, hey, we've got it, and it's now embedded in a commercial data set? And at the same time, they're making enormous capital investments to bring this information to market. So in closing, I guess I want to carry on some of the themes I think that Molly brought forth and suggest that as a community we need to get our act together pretty quickly, right? We need to make sure that we recognize the value of the geospatial content we have, and we need to really work hard to ensure that we become that trusted source for geospatial content, right? I think the one thing government agencies have going for them is that they can reduce that time to market. We are the first agency to touch a new address or a new parcel. And so how do we leverage that position in our marketplace, right? At the same time, many of us, and Molly mentioned this, many of us have been working on GIS applications and public-facing internet sites, right? I know in Oakland we're challenging that. Why do we need to do that anymore? Can't we just make the geospatial content we have available and let the community at large develop an environmental site, develop a parkway site, a trail site? At the same time, I think as a geospatial group, we are focused on knowledge, not commodities, right? And to that end, we're really taking our focus away from public access and public applications and turning it inward and saying, hey, let's focus on integrating this technology in more and more business applications, continuing to knock down those organizational boundaries, jurisdictional boundaries, and making government more efficient. And at the same time then embracing the private sector to do the things we traditionally tried to do on the web. So I think you'll see that many of the themes are the same from what Molly presented from the EPA's perspective. Maybe the context is a little different and the view's a little different, but I think it's something we need to challenge ourselves to think about as we see all these forces converging down on the traditional use of the technology.
Thanks, Scott. Now let's turn to something that may be completely different or may be quite similar. Pat, we've seen two governments talk about a great change that's represented by much more data, many more data users, and some of the control of the traditional governmental GIS work moving apparently inevitably to outside government sources, both in the private sector itself and in the public. Is this what you're seeing from Esri's perspective is happening in government? What sort of trends that apply to this cross-boundary transformation in GIS land do you see?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. I think what you'll see here, kind of the ESRI perspective, what we've seen across the landscape, working with our user base and the GIS community at large, is that we see things very similarly. I think Molly making the point and Scott reiterating that it's really kind of moving to this service, kind of a service focus. One of the things I would want to point out is that there is still a lot of focus on the data, and we are still responsible stewards of that data, but those expectations of that data have grown tremendously with the number of people who have access to this information. And it's not enough now just to have the data to kind of create, maintain, and use that data internally, but we are responsible for now pushing that out so the broader community can have access to it. So some of what you'll see in the slides I've put together here, we can skip over quickly because Molly and Scott have covered it quite nicely. But I will point out picked up a few things that we see as trends, and then I'll just add a little detail to some of the items that they raised. So here, just the acknowledgement that the application of GIS is growing, and it's growing into the areas that are not traditionally kind of spatially focused. As Scott pointed out, kind of into the typical kind of government business functions are now being spatially enabled, where maybe they need to have GIS logic behind them, but they don't need a traditional map presented to them. So it becomes more transparent, as he pointed out. So it's the ability to work in the background to bring complex issues together, analyze those, and then present kind of the simplified answers or conclusions to the person asking the question, and then making that accessible across the web. And I think that's really the foundation for setting up all this collaboration that we're beginning to see. And that's really what's going to be key for transforming the way government works. So I think here it's like whether the enabling business functions is tying the spatial component to all your financials, or mapping human service delivery was not often thought of as a stronghold for GIS, but we're certainly seeing that coming on very strong. And okay, now we've got this. Okay. As we move through the slides here, I think as Jerry pointed out at the beginning, we all know that kind of place is the foundation. Space is one of those dimensions that's very critical. I think everybody on in the seminar here is aware of that, but it gives that common foundation or framework for everyone to come together, bring otherwise data that's otherwise hard to pull together can come together on the landscape in the focus of the place. And as we look at this from a technology standpoint, there are some very common patterns. And over the years, as GIS has grown, when Jerry asked us to think about kind of the maturity of GIS, and we have our core GIS professionals who used to do their work, kind of the GIS geek work over in the corner, and then they put out some maps. And that evolved into kind of this work group where there's some collaboration within an organization with multiple users building applications against a common database, but still their applications were unique. And now we're really moving into this federated model where multiple organizations are coming together to share their information. What we're talking about here, it's not just sharing the data, but now sharing those services. And kind of the web is giving us that platform for really integrating and implementing these things. So everybody can be responsible for their piece and give up. Not everybody has to fine-tune the base map anymore, but they need to focus on their environmental data or the environmental models that run against that data, and make those models and those services and those data sets available for others to use as a consumable service. So we're really starting to see how the web is changing the way we look and who our community is. We're well beyond the bounds of the programs within our department and really reaching out in multiple levels of government, academia, and private sector to really get the job done and have these collaborative partnerships going on out there. So what we're seeing is this bringing together this system of systems, kind of individual GIS systems and these geo-services. You've heard Scott and Molly both talk about the services, and it's really the ability to bring the services together in this IT environment is opening the door for a lot of collaboration and a whole new community of people who are not traditionally GIS people, leveraging these resources and driving demand for more of those resources to be available. And so as we move through these slides here, I think what we see is that we're going to be fusing all kinds of things together over the web. And once you put your services out there, a lot of people will be jumping in and using those, and you're really not going to have any idea how they're going to be using those or what kind of business problems they're applying those to. You're going to be having people bringing kind of consumer-based maps together with their own local GIS data. They're going to be doing mashups, on the fly using all kinds of different tools. Another thing we'll see is this integration kind of geo-referencing a lot of the content that's out there on the web. We think of spatial data and the services that drive the spatial data as kind of our core GIS stuff. But now we've got geo-RSS feeds, and we're going to be spatially enabling or geotagging photos of places and documents and other things. It's going to bring a spatial component to the wealth of information that's out there on the web that we don't typically think about these days in the GIS context. I think I'll skip over that. And the way some of this comes together, we've talked a lot about the kind of geo-services. I think a big breakthrough here is that we're now having, the GIS people now speak IT. We're talking shared services, we're talking service-oriented architecture, and we're talking a whole new tier for integration. Molly mentioned standards and the great work that OGC has done on geospatial standards, but now the GIS world can't stop at OGC standards. We're talking IT standards, and have to make sure we're implementing those too so the GIS can be embedded, as Scott was mentioning, in the typical business systems or other IT systems. And this graphic just tries to depict that we still have our power users at the bottom who are maintaining the data, and they're creating creating the data and then pushing that out through the services tier. So all of those data services, the models, the map services, globe services are all available kind of on this enterprise service bus level for any type of client application to use. And I think that's really kind of where we're seeing things happen, where it's really going to open it up for tremendous growth in the future. And if we just drill down in that graphic a little bit, that's kind of overwhelming to some people, but another way to look at it is if you've got your different program areas and they continue to do their business as usual, whether it's it's dealing with food safety or it's human services issues, they can kind of do their it's locally managed and it still meets their business needs, but then the service piece they can stick on there, say, now I'm going to push that out as a service. That makes it available for others to use. So you can meet your internal needs and push the data and functionality out for others to consume it. And I'm going to jump real quickly here. Two key pieces here are that what's really powering this is that the GIS services and servers that the GIS professionals are responsible for are really providing that foundation to make all this information available out on the web so these collaborative communities can grab hold of it and use it. So if the GIS servers are the foundation, and then these GIS viewers provide the access. And the viewers have really matured. We're looking at, we've got Google Earth, we've got the Microsoft Virtual Earth, and other tools out there that provide these visualization tools. You're now in those simple applications or viewing tools also able to run other geo tasks or functions, whether it's find a route or find an address or find the nearest, all those great things that these two pieces together are opening the door for so many people to jump in and then also contribute data in that same way. And I think some of this we've really gone over. Another kind of a high growth area where we see trends really happening is going to be an explosion of GIS out in the field. And the handheld devices that are available to the mobile workforce and that we can push different applications out in the field. They're connected by the web. It's really going to change the workflow. It's going to streamline the workflow in government, improve efficiency, and that whole service to citizen that's driving a lot of what we do, and the citizen expectations that governments are ready and able to do this kind of thing. Another area that we see a lot of change happening is in imagery. With the popularization of maps and aerial photography through Google Earth and others, people expect that when they go there and they see a map, they don't understand that the imagery might be a year or two old. And so there's going to be tremendous demand to get imagery out there faster. And we certainly see that in response to the disasters. And in the past, there's been quite a bit of lag time due to processing from when you can get the film off the plane and then get it out on a website. So there's new technologies that make it kind of within the hour sort of turnaround time on getting imagery out there and available to the public. So we're going to see that. And then one last one I'll point out is kind of, I think Molly and Scott both mentioned that now a lot of people are saying, my business isn't creating the best base map. My business is putting out environmental information. So let somebody else create that base map and provide that service, and I'll ride on top of it. And so this whole idea of using or leveraging commercial online services or using hosting services to offload some of that burden and let government organizations focus on their core business functions is something that we're certainly seeing a growth in. And then I want to jump down to two quick examples. I think we'll see a lot more fun stuff with the visualization too. And I just want to wrap up with I'll probably just do two examples here. What are the business? I think one of the things Jerry asked, kind of the best business practices for collaboration. I wanted to point out two, and one of them is the Mountain Agency Task Force in Southern California, where they knew they were going to have wildfire problems because of tremendous amounts of dead trees. And they had they had 14 government agencies, 5 private companies. They all came together saying, we know we're going to have problems here. Let's get our act together ahead of time. And they really did work collaboratively to come up with one shared database that they could all use for the response and actually for the cleanup afterwards. I do have a graphic of that, but I want to jump to the next one, which is a little bit even cooler, and then they tie together, and then I'll be done here. Another example is Loma Linda University, and they're in the business of saving lives. They run a hospital and work with doctors, but they also have some pretty innovative folks there who said, to save lives, we need to get our patients to the right hospitals the fastest way we can, and with our dispatch tools right now, we can't do it. So they embarked on a project to say, how do we better meet the needs of our patients, really, and save lives in the end. So they actually embarked on a project that leverages these web services, real-time information, and multiple partners. And I'll just show you quickly, it becomes real obvious. When they started to say, what do we need to do to answer these questions, they said, we need to know which hospitals have space available. We need to know what the traffic conditions are out there. We need to know if there are any accidents on the highway right now, like within minutes. Because we're dealing with helicopter dispatch, we also need to know the current weather conditions. And then we also need to have some kind of base maps so we have context for what we're doing. So they built an application with all these different partners where they're getting real-time feeds, like this one from Caltrans in the state of California, where they get up to the date. Every 2 minutes it's updated with speed sensors, traffic volumes, and the webcam. So they can their dispatchers can see whether they should route an ambulance to this hospital on this road or to another hospital on another route. The Meteorologics is a commercial weather service that comes through updated every 15 minutes. They built this application separate from the massed wildland fire team. But then when we had fires burning in the Loma Linda area, they kind of figured out on the fly, we already have these web services set up, so we can actually integrate the Loma Linda application with the boundaries of the wildfires being fought and where the teams have been deployed there. So it was a real interesting kind of, as it evolved, how you bring the different players together and expanding the collaboration. And I think I'll wrap it up with that, Jerry. and see if we have time for any other questions.
Well,
To rush
thanks.
through it, but I didn't want to repeat too much what what Scott and Molly said.
We all rushed through it, and of course we didn't get done in time for a large number of questions unless we extend, which I'm certainly willing to do at this point. At least I will be here to listen for the next 15 minutes to some questions, and we have gotten some. There was one particular question that came in here from Michael, who was saying that as part of the customer's desire is to have the data more accessible, how do you see the offline usage extending to off-network use, either on laptops or especially on smartphones? Do either of you have a perspective on that question?
Well, I think as a strategy in Oakland, one of the things we're going to do is not only make the data available for consumption in web services, but also make it available for download in that same format. And so there's a variety of ways you can do that. We've done it historically through what we call our one-stop shop, and people can come in and grab data and use it for individual project-based analysis or for their own use. And we'll just continue that, but maybe begin to take advantage of some new ways to deliver the data.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I have a question for you folks on, it seems to me when I talk to most senior leaders of most governmental operations, they're used to talking about change in terms of 10 or 15% maybe at the high end per year, but it seems to me we may be at a position with GIS that's much more like what a student of mine who went on to Harvard and was involved in making all the maps available electronically. And he said it wasn't a 10 or 15% difference in usage once they completed that project. It was 150 times usage that they were starting to get as people got access to stuff, brought other people in, showing them access, the people leading on to other people. So are we in a position where the explosion in data availability is leading to a related explosion in data usage that is just way beyond what most people outside of this field are aware of yet? Have I overstated it, or is that about right? And if it is, what are the implications for us in terms of getting leaders to understand this and make sensible choices now? Maybe that's for you, Molly. Maybe that's for you, Scott. Or maybe, Pat, that's for you.
This is Molly. Let me start by this. Jerry, I don't think you're overstating it, and I do believe that senior leaders really don't know about the explosion. But I would say, geospatial is clearly ripe for radical change, and not at the 10 to 15% at all. I would say, though, the explosion for a lot of access to environmental information beyond GIS is transforming as well. And I don't believe that most people understand the kind of transformation that we're coming to. I was using an example of earlier in the week talking about the transformation in terms of, from a technology standpoint, how we went 15 years ago from, typing pools on how, and having to retrain administrative staff that we no longer have typing pools for new skills. That was, to me, a pretty radical change, but not at the 150%. But here we're talking about the demand of information, and especially in terms, and sort of a click away. It is just huge and transforming, and being able to, as government officials and senior leaders in government, is to be able to put that out as fast as we can with the amount of certainty that we can, is really going to be a challenge. And if we don't put it out, someone else will in today's sort of social networking and everything else. So I agree with what you're saying, and in particular with GIS, because it's really become people are getting used to using some of the new tools and the visualization out there, that it's one of the leading parts of it, and it's forcing some of the at least some thinking in terms of this bigger challenge for access to information, I think, for the senior leadership for government. But I think we're all getting there. It's just a matter of how do we move things that we're comfortable, especially if you're a science-based organization. And that's, I think Scott's right. I mean, part of it is it about the data, and he's right. And in many ways, for us, it's about scientific data. But if we don't put it out there, what other group is going to put it out there? It's let's say we have 17,000 employees roughly at EPA. I wonder how many environmental professionals there are. Are we 5% of the community now? Are we 3%? So it's an absolutely amazing time.
Yeah, Jerry, I think you're right on target, that this really, you're not overstating it at all in where we think the usage of this technology is going to go. And I think one thing that backs that up is, I think it was in 2004, the Department of Labor came out with a report on kind of their top 10 growth job areas. And geospatial made the list of the top 10 job sectors. I can't remember what they called it. And they were actually anticipating that this is an area there will be difficulty filling the demand for jobs in this area because of the anticipated growth.
Yeah, and I would echo, from a local government perspective, echo Molly's comments, is that one of the things we struggle with every day is that the demand for geospatial services on our organization is more than we can keep up with. So we do IT master planning over a 2-year period, and we had, starting October 1 of this year, over 66,000 man-hours of requests that are on the board, and more have come in since then. And so it's how do we balance, as Molly very eloquently stated, the demand and the ability to deliver those services before they look elsewhere. And we're seeing it in very, very abstract, everything from offender tethering and, tracking public health sanitarians, a lot of the location-based services and being able to manage your resources effectively are, and the downsizing in local government has really caused our departments to react and be able to leverage the technology so they can effectively, allocate their resources. So we're seeing a huge demand.
Scott, where can people turn to if they don't turn to the local government for the major sources of information that you're offering?
Well, it just depends on the currency, Jerry. I think, you look at addresses as a critical component, right? So local governments may have the most current, i.e. within, let's say, a week of when the structures can built, address information for that. But, it won't be too long. Maybe it's a 6-month cycle. Maybe it's a 1-year cycle. And then the private sector picks it right up and makes it available in the commercially available data sets. And so, it varies based on the government agencies in the area, but, certainly I think that there aren't too many update frequencies that are more than a year in the private sector any longer because so many private sector corporations are counting on that data as a critical part of their business.
Let me push a bit to you, Pat, and an ESRI observation that was in Scott's presentation about the need for accuracy in data. And certainly, we've all heard garbage in, garbage out, and we worry about people drilling places that they shouldn't drill. At the same time, I could pull back to look at Molly's history in the toxics release inventory. That was garbage data in many ways. It did not relate closely to health or environmental impacts that were of great concern to many of the scientists who looked at things. It was just pounds of everything put out there. But by making it available, it created a lot of uses and applications and mobilized a community of people who cared, to the point where I think a lot of people would say, net, we're much better off, even though we were quite worried about how garbagey the data was. As we look to the future, are we, how should we balance this? Let 1,000 people get in with all sorts of data and start sharing it, and as opposed to being very concerned about the precision of the data and the poor decisions that might be made if the decisions were made on that data. How should we think about this?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting to pose that to the private sector. We offer tools that will accommodate whatever level of data accuracy you have, and it's really on the government side that has to have the policies in place to drive what level of accuracy they will accept. We also have been doing a lot of work in working with FGDC and others on how do you document, how do you create metadata easily so people will actually do it. So you can document the data source. So you know who it came from. Did it come from the local community group or the 4-H kid who's in their program to do GIS? Or did it come from a scientist at EPA, and what were the collection methods? Depending on who you're talking to and how they're going to use the data, their requirements for accuracy will be different. I mean, we advocate for getting more and more information out in the public, and I think until you push even that garbage data out there, you have no incentive to clean up that data. You know, in my days in state government, we fought those battles all the time, and we couldn't make the air emissions data available because it wasn't very good. We didn't have confidence in it. But until you exposed that, then there really was no incentive to clean it up. So we really, on the private sector, on the software side, we've tried to come up with tools that make it easier to collect that data, easier to maintain that data. I think some of what Scott touched on and where we've seen some innovative projects is this kind of transactional update and maintenance of the data, where local governments are working with state governments so that it's transactionally maintained as close to the source as possible so the data is up to date. And then through replication and other technologies, we can make sure everybody's looking at the same data.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let me insert a question, and we will go for another 10 minutes and then cut it off. David Arbite has a question here that says, to what extent do quote-unquote cost recovery or license restrictions of governments inhibit our taking advantage of transformational non-governmental applications of geospatial data? As you look at that locally or federally, or Pat, from your perspective, how should we answer David's question?
Well, this is Scott from Oakland County. Well, it's interesting. The Michigan perspective is a bit unique in that. In the mid to late 90s, Oakland County helped sponsor legislation called Enhanced Access. And essentially, the goal there was to, in some respects, protect government's investment in geospatial technology and allow for them to charge for enhanced access rather than have millions of dollars worth of data being collected through traditional FOIA methods. Well, you know, we took full advantage of that, and from about 98 to up to this year even, we've seen about $500,000 a year in revenue come in through online applications and online access to land or geospatial data. Well, what we've seen and what we've done essentially as we've considered where we need to go in the future is that we've put together a business plan that walks away from that, you know, nearly $250,000 a year in revenue now, because there's more value in getting the information out in the hands of our constituents than that revenue can possibly protect for the government. And so we found other ways to offset that revenue by reducing costs, mitigating infrastructure that we would need to maintain that chargeback mechanism, and essentially Oakland County is walking away from $250,000 a year in revenue in light of all these things that have happened, you know, with the Googles of the world, the Zillows of the world, and others. We feel very strongly that getting current, correct information in the hands of our constituents is more important.
Mm-hmm. Interesting observation. Pat, do you see that happening in other governmental settings? Molly, do you see an analogy there in the federal government?
Yeah, I think the trend has certainly gone to making more and more information available out there. It's easier to do now than it was 10 years ago. So we used to argue on the side that we could charge for the cost of reproducing the data, but not the cost of creating the data. It's kind of a typical model for at least state government. Local governments tend to look at it differently. But I think what we've also seen is that sometimes if you get the information out there, expose people to it, kind of get them addicted to it, then they're going to help you kind of drive for more resources to create more data, maintain those resources, the spatial data that people have become dependent on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those comments. You know, it is easier to deliver it these days, especially if you do it from a service perspective, and so you know, I don't really think this is something that you know, that we want to put too much emphasis in terms of cost recovery on it when it's a service, at least from a government perspective. It's data that's already available.
We don't have much time. What I'd like to do is to go around our table and, in fact, get some sense of parting advice to this community of people who care about geospatial information, who care about the changes that are taking place in both how we collect it, store it, share it, use it, analyze it, and the services that come excuse me, from it. But as we look to the future, what will be the most important things for us to be successful as we go forward? Let me do it in the same order that we started, and pick on you first, Molly.
Well, I think in terms of the future, I really think the future is, is making the information available from a services perspective, using some of the Web 2.0 technologies, which means government as a whole is going to be changing. I do believe so. And, how far we take it is one issue, whether we dip our toes in certain areas, which is already occurring now. But there's an opportunity, I think, for people in the GIS community clearly to work on really innovative and interesting work because of it through the data integration. I thought Pat did a great job in showing sort of the future and saying it's not just displaying, points on a dot, dots on a map anymore. It's really integrated the services and some of the other information. And I really think that's the area that we're moving towards, whether it's having the professionals in the GIS community help us integrate those services in terms of the business applications geospatially, as well as looking at some of the Web 2.0 and looking at how we get citizens involved in government. I really think that's where some of the transformation is going to be.
Super. Scott?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I know many of our local government peers are still struggling with in their geospatial programs is relevance, right? Relevance in the larger IT context, relevance to their decision makers, and one of the things that we have found is that relevance comes from being part of county business, right? Being integrated as part of the service delivery, and then as I mentioned, 911, tax and administration, and other major county and typical government functions. And so one of the things that I think that many of our local government peers need to be focused on is delivering that business solution. It's not about just maintaining data anymore. It's about delivering services and solutions to your constituent groups, and ultimately then that relevance will feed a strong program, which will then allow us to take advantage of the technologies Molly mentioned and deliver services not only internally but also externally to our constituent groups. So.
Very good. Pat?
Okay, I guess I'd wrap up saying that that we're really in a great position, I think, to kind of leverage the enthusiasm and maybe the awakening of kind of our society on the importance of geography, whether it's through kind of the Google Earth effect or watching through wartime some of the GIS stuff they're using there, or it's OnStar in your car. People are realizing that place does matter and that there are these tools that exist to do that. And yet at the same time, while we kind of ride the wave of consumers thinking GIS is really, it's simple point and click and I can get all the answers I need, to be able to deliver that to them, whether they're citizens or they're our coworkers or our managers in our jobs, it's really going to demand that the GIS professionals continue doing what they're doing in the background and maintaining the data, creating those services, and pushing those out so that it looks kind of that fun and easy delivering the answers when they need them with up-to-date information. So it's not going to, kind of the hardcore stuff in the background doesn't go away, but the leveraging of that to multiple channels out in the community is really where I think the fun's going to happen. And we're finally really moving beyond just making pretty maps and doing some pretty sophisticated stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. I mean, thanks Molly, thanks Scott, thanks Pat, and thanks audience for staying with us as we sort of overstayed our time zone here. But it's been an important set of issues, I think, not only in the direct application of these thoughts and these experiences to GIS work, where it's becoming such a big set of activities that it's cross-boundary. It is transformational and changing. It is requiring us to adapt and therefore requiring leaders who know it's not the same kind of control they exercised before of down and in. It's much more across and out and negotiated and staying alert to what's happening because you can't predict it all in advance. We think that those kind of cross-boundary transformational challenges for leadership are happening, yes, in GIS, but happening in other domains of concern in the public sector around the globe. And if the audience is interested in that, we will explore that for our next step here at Harvard on October the 10th and the 11th, where we're going to run a workshop called Cross-Boundary Leadership Taking Action, where we are specifically looking at the kinds of tools that governments are using to not only think about cross-boundary transformation, but increasingly to act on it, and we hope act effectively. So again, thanks everyone, and let me turn it back to Jim.
Thank you, Jerry, and thanks everyone for attending. Thanks for your help putting this together and making it a success.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the invitation, Jerry.
Okie doke. Thanks very much, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.